Welcome, everyone, to day 3 of our Standards for Professional Learning Week. I'm Paul Fleming, Chief Learning Officer at Learning Forward, and together with my colleague, Elizabeth Foster, Vice President for Standards and Research, welcome you to today's webinar on developing policy pathways to support high-quality professional learning. This will be an interactive session, and we encourage you to put your questions and your ideas in the chat, as we'll have a Q&A section later in the hour. We also encourage you to stay for our Standards Lab immediately following the webinar to learn more about today's policy pathway tool in a much more informal setting. You'll see a separate Zoom link in the chat during the webinar during this hour in order to access the Standards Lab immediately following at 4 p.m. Eastern. So today we'll be unveiling our new tool, the Policy Pathways to Standards Implementation, and we'll have a conversation also with a special district leader guest about the importance of standards-aligned policy at the local level. We also want to thank you if you've joined us yesterday and on Monday, and you'll also want to come back tomorrow and Friday for sessions on our revised Standards Assessment Inventory, which is hot off the press, and our new equity tool called Selected Resources for Equity Challenges. Also pleased, and I mentioned our special guest, and we're excited to have Betty Wilson McSwain, the Director of Federal Programs for the Macomb School District in Mississippi, with us today. So welcome, Betty, and so glad that you are with us. So we want to start today by hearing from you, and thank you for all of those of you that have put your name and your location and your role in the chat, because we know that this has been a significant year since the release of the standards in April of 2022. And we would love for you to take a moment and to identify how familiar you are with the standards for professional learning, and just to put that number in the chat. So for example, 1, this is your first exposure. 2, I've read the standards and some of the resources. 3, I know the standards fairly well and am currently implementing them in my context. And 4, I know the standards well enough to teach them to others. Wow, thank you for putting those in the chat. As you can see, such a variety, a lot of 2s, a lot of 3s. And that makes perfect sense to us, because we do know there's a lot to unpack, and as you're going to hear from our special guest today, ways in which the standards, both on a policy front, but also on a practice front, can be utilized at the district and at the state level. And so again, keep those numbers coming, but we thank you for putting those in, because we know that we're all kind of learners in this environment, especially with these revised standards that we have. So again, really appreciate that, especially for those of you and those that are putting in your numbers on the 2 and the 3 level as well. So we also want to just thank our sponsors briefly for their generous contributions for the development of the standards that came out in April of 2022, including the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Hewlett Foundation, and the Schusterman Family Foundation, because that allowed us, as you're going to hear today, and you've heard this week, to get significant input from stakeholders, from a Standards Advisory Council over the last 24 months, to develop and to shape both the standards and the tools, including the tool that we're going to be talking about today. And that's why without that generous support, we would not be able to bring you this suite of tools, and also, frankly, the standards that were released last year. So at this point, we want to, and especially as you're mentioning in the chat, those levels of understanding. We know from our audience today, we have varying levels of understanding about the standards. And we also know and excited to share that how much has changed in the research world and in evidence world over the last 10 years, and the impact that research can have. So we were very fortunate to partner with AIR to have them conduct both a literature review and a meta-analysis about the standards and the constructs in the 2022 standards. And if you can see on that second bullet, what we're excited to share, right, is that there's consistent evidence that program alignment with the standards is associated with both improved teacher instruction and student achievement outcomes. This is significant because we know, and all of you know, kind of the rigorous construct and the rigorous nature of a meta-analysis done by our partners at AIR, right? And so this is actually a featured resource, and here is the actual title of the resource called Using Meta-Analysis to Understand Professional Learning Standards. It is available as one of our research resources on the standards website at standards.learningforward.org. And again, we really can't say enough about the partnership we have with AIR and that team led by Rachel Garrett for providing this strong evidence base that we're going to see. So I want to share with you just a couple of highlights and takeaways from the overview of this meta-analysis here. And so one, if you see here on the findings overview, right? Couple quick headlines. One, each of the standards was positively associated, right, with teacher instruction and positively and significantly associated with student achievement. Two, as you're going to see in a moment, there was a range of effect sizes that were statistically significant, but were all significantly different from zero. And third, there was still a positive but non-significant effect for the revised leadership standard. And we certainly are continuing to work with AIR to learn more about why that is happening, especially within the leadership strand there. And so if you look at this overview, both on the impact on teacher instruction, we'll see that the effect sizes are significant, and they're significant for all of the standards with, as I mentioned, the exception of the leadership standard here. And that is profound and also significant, but based on the constructs that are here and the positive effect that it has on teacher instruction. This is also true on the positive effect with the significant effect sizes on student achievement. And I want to briefly just highlight and point out our three equity standards: the equity foundations, equity drivers, and equity outcomes for students, and the impact that we know certainly qualitatively the impact that equity has on reaching all learners, reaching all educators, and now there's the evidence base within these three equity standards to show significant positive impact on student achievement. So there's a lot there to unpack in the meta-analysis, and we hope that you'll take time to review and to unpack that in the brief that's on our standards website, but wanted to share with you some of those key takeaways to help inform why standards for professional learning are so necessary. And also, as you're going to hear again today from our special guest, what does that look like and sound like at the district level, right? And the impact that it can have, right? So, what's nice is that also then reinforces what we often call kind of our change theory or theory of action for how the standards lead to improvement for all learners. So if you look specifically at that purple section there, right, the high quality professional learning for educators, we know number one, it has to be grounded in the standards, right? Because I think often see and we've often experienced as educators, professional learning that is not grounded and aligned to our standards, and what that means then for students and for other educators. And so we know now with the evidence base in our standards that in order to get to that growth in the green sections you see for educator knowledge, skills, and beliefs, and growth in educator practice, how important it is that they're one, grounded in the standards, and two, that provides them the gateway and the pathway to get to improved outcomes for all students. And so that's why by design, these sections are touching each other within this visual, and also acknowledging that both growth in educator knowledge, skills, and beliefs is innately tied to growth in educator practice. And those two move often together, which is why it's reflected in the visual there. And so as you'll see, hopefully the kind of the rationale here, the why for why it's important that high quality professional learning is grounded in the evidence base that we've just been sharing in the standards for professional learning, right? It also is, we often call this, right, the standards wheel or the standards pie. This visual of the revised standards shows how all 11 standards, right, are connected. In fact, we had one of our educators in a presentation recently said this reminded her of a windmill. And if you removed one blade on the windmill, just like if you took out one standard, it would still work, but it would be less efficient and less effective. And that's what we believe about how standards need to work together in a systems approach. And we also know that's where you see a strong impact at the district and at the state level when high quality professional learning is integrated and is actually in the DNA of a system. And that's why we believe this is important. And hence the visual also shows the impact, right, of how the standards touch each other and also impact each other as well. So also just wanted to love the windmill approach, and we need to add that as well. I'm thinking, Elizabeth, as we're continuing to work here, talk about it, right? So I think many of you are familiar with the 3 frames that are now provided in the standards to group all 11 standards, right? So there's the rigorous content for each learner that actually features our 3 new standards, including equity practices, curriculum assessment and instruction, and professional expertise. You see the transformational processes with the grouping of those 4, and then finally the conditions for success. And so very deliberately, those standards are aligned to a specific frame, and a strong rationale for why they're aligned to each one of the 3 frames, right? So a quick overview of those frames really starts with the rigorous content, right, for each learner, and being explicit about what do adult learners need to actually get better and more improved student outcomes. And this is where that grouping, again, of the practices, the curriculum assessment and instruction, and the professional expertise that every educator needs to develop is so important within this frame. And this is often described as the what, right? Think about the content and the what that every adult learner needs in order to get better outcomes for each student. Followed, is again connected and very closely to the how, right? The transformational processes are the how for how these 4 provide that roadmap for educators. Thinking about the learning designs that we know is so important, thinking about the types of evidence that we need to gather, and also thinking about what are those practices that educators use in the classroom as part of the equity drivers, for example, right? So all of those are again, there's a reason why those are grouped so tightly with the transformational processes piece. And then finally, thinking about the foundation. And I know as a former high school principal, I know it's especially how important the connection between, for example, leadership is with creating a culture of equity and creating a culture of collaborative inquiry in a school building, and then making sure the resources are there to connect the dots, right? And make sure every educator has the resources. So that's why those 4 are found in our foundational conditions for success frame and by design. And so we know that going from 7 to 11 standards, from the 2011 standards to 2022, is a change, but we also wanted to show how those are connected so tightly to each frame. It also wanted just to show briefly different ways that we know different entry points into the standards. So if you see on the left, we mentioned the standards wheel, we mentioned on the standards website, there's a way that you can digitally, or you can go online and see each of the standards and actually interact with each of the standards in our standards wheel. There's also then the standards summary that's on the right, which is a way to give each standard statement for all 11 standards as a quick view of what the standards are. And then we also know there's the narrative of each standard, right? And so the standards book, here's the link is here at the bottom to access the actual standards book. And we hope that if you haven't already purchased or received the standards book, that you do so, because that's really the meat of where the standards lie, is in the narrative. And that really connects to this piece about what is included as in each standard, right? So by design, there's a common stem for all 11 standards. There are then the listing of the 3 components or constructs and the narrative that follows. And that's what's in the standards book, followed by then what are the connections of that particular standard to other standards within the system. And that's also intentionally pointed out in the standards, as well as the selected research that is there at the end. And so again, by design, there's following a consistent format of what each standard looks like and sounds like. We also, again, wanted to mention just briefly by design that there are 3 equity standards, 1 in each frame, and how they are connected, right? So thinking again about what does equity at the foundational level look like for developing a vision and a culture of expectations, right? What are the equity practices needed for in the classroom? What do those look like so that each student, right, it feels valued and has opportunities for success? And then finally, what are those opportunities for adult learners and how professional learning is designed at the system level in equity drivers to make sure every educator experiences success. Because we know that if for student learning to change, right, we need to make sure that adult learning is changing as well and is personalized as well. And so the final piece I want to just showcase before we bring in my colleague Elizabeth to showcase and talk about the tool for today is just where we are in the last year. And so this is on our standards website. You can see how many unique page views there are, how many thousands of downloads of our current suite of tools before the set of tools that we're releasing this week, how many video views there have been. And then I think probably perhaps most importantly, a majority of countries in the global website visitors from a majority of those countries in the world that have visited the standards website as a way of showing the global reach of both high quality professional learning and the standards for professional learning as well. And so all of this, just as a reminder, can be found, including the tools we're releasing this week on the standards.learningforward.org website. And this includes what's already there and what you heard if you attended yesterday around the vignettes and the IC maps, around the action guides, the research resources that I was mentioning earlier in the webinar today. All of that is in the Walmart one-stop shop, right, of the Learning Forward website. So we have that there at your disposal, and we'll make sure if you don't have that, we'll put that in the chat as well. So welcome, Elizabeth. I know you're excited to be part of this as well. And I know that as we've been thinking about this tool, by design, we know the challenges, right, that are out there for districts, for states, for regions to think about how do you really get deeper implementation of the standards at a policy level to really help every system, right, grow and develop, and therefore every student. So I'm really excited to have you showcase this tool and to walk us through and to talk about what it is. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, I am really excited that we're adding this policy tool to our suite of tools because when we released the standards a year ago, we had some policy guidance, which was sort of in the form of a PDF, sort of recommendations and examples of how states and districts had adopted or been using the standards over the years. But we're also getting a lot of calls and requests for conversations from educators interested in really talking about their own policy context. What does this mean for me? How do I contextualize given that my state has already adopted the standards or my state is not adopting the standards? And what could I do to encourage and support implementation? What kinds of policy moves and steps could I take as an educator to help support and protect the use of the standards? So this led us to develop a sort of graphic on top of a graphic. We were struck by how many different pathways districts and states were embracing as they were thinking about policy. And this new tool highlights a lot of different examples for how policy can support the use of the standards. So you see there is state level adoption. There's also district adoption and use, referencing the standards in regulation and code, using the standards as guidance for applications for professional learning or for resource and funding decisions. And then we know that in some states, the standards are used in evaluation and professional learning frameworks and systems for both principals and teachers. So we wanted to use a graphic that mirrored the standards, graphic, but also that showed that there were a lot of different ways policy can support the standards. It's not state adoption or not state adoption. There are a lot of different options. The other thing I'll mention is that in our conversations, we were seeing a lot of connections to the work we were doing around Title II advocacy and our work to build educator capacity, educators at all levels, to build their capacity to become advocates for professional learning policy decisions. We have a whole campaign focused on advocating for federal Title II funding. And we've seen how enthusiastically educators embrace that role, and then the power of educators telling their stories about the value of professional learning. So we wanted to capture that momentum as well. And so part of what you'll see in this tool is our encouragement to all educators to become advocates. The other big question I'll just say that we were hearing is, how do I get started? And so this tool is really designed to support people as they start the process and sort of walk through the process of becoming policy advocates. So I'm going to give you a little tour of the tool, and then we will talk with Betty Wilson-McSwain, who's done a lot of great policy and standards advocacy work in Mississippi. But I'll start by walking through this tool. It is available on our website now. This is the first day. It's very exciting for all of us. So please do take a look at that if you get a chance. So as I said, the purpose is really to illustrate these multiple pathways to support educators, especially educators working in teams, to make progress toward their own policy goals. And then to provide a structure to help people capture their progress toward their policy goal and come up with a solid plan that can be shared with colleagues and allies and policymakers. So this is sort of the background. There are two parts to this tool. One is, the first part is sort of background about why policy is important, all the ways that policy can sort of help sustain efforts to implement the standards, provide a way or a pathway to scale where the standards are being used well and effectively. And then really to help ensconce and protect standards related policy as leaders change positions, as people move from one role to another, so that policy piece helps to sort of ground and sustain the standards effort, even as the people may change positions in a state or a district. So this first part of the tool is designed to provide some of that background, but you'll see throughout this tool, we also provide links to other tools that Learning Forward has developed over the years. So there's a blog linked here about how to make the connection for policymakers. There are examples, links to examples of all of those different policy pathways that I described and that you see in the circle graphic. We know this is a starting point and an entry point for people doing this work. And we know that this is a long-term effort that involves multiple individuals in different roles. So we've created this tool that's interactive that you can come back to on a regular basis to sort of build your plan, build your argument, and incorporate what you're learning along the way. So it's a writable PDF so that you can download it and save it and use it as your guiding document for making progress towards, as you make progress towards your policy goal.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, Elizabeth, because I know, like myself, as a former assistant commissioner in the Tennessee Department of Education, know that you have to do this in collaboration with other offices, other departments, and I think that's no different whether the state level, the district level, the regional level as well. That this is a learning team opportunity, and as you were saying, and I think that's really powerful. This is not to be done in isolation as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for underscoring that. So I will just get right into, again, this is another, I guess we are really emphasizing this point that there are multiple pathways, because in this tool, it also sort of describes what all of these pathways can look like. And again, you see examples of where we have found that states or districts are taking these particular policy steps. We also left a section, a writable section, open to name your own policy goal, because as we were engaging in these conversations about supporting the standards implementation through policy, we would hear about maybe a policy move that was very specific to that state, a specific form, for instance, that if adapted to include the standards could be a lever for a lot of change at the district level. So we left this as an open-ended question for people to include their own policy goals, and all the steps that follow will still apply. So we start out by inviting people to consider, so each question on the tool gives a suggestion for a step. So consider your sphere of influence, assemble the policy team with a rationale for each step, and then guiding questions for each step that are followed by the writable section. So for this, for assembling the policy team, we ask people to think about the names and roles of the 8 to 10 people they'd like to collaborate with, identify why they are the right people to include on the team, and make sure that you're attending to a diversity of roles and backgrounds as you're assembling that policy team. And again, as I said, we think of this as a document that's meant to guide and evolve. So as you're developing your policy team, thinking more and more about the collective sphere of influence, some of these answers will necessarily change, but that's what it's designed to do as you all work together toward this goal. We do talk a lot about building understanding of the standards, building a shared understanding of not only the standards, but why professional learning is an important and impactful investment. And we offer some resources that help you make that argument to your colleagues on your advocacy team, and then to policymakers you are attempting to engage in this shared understanding as well. This is a weighty part of the tool itself. Reviewing current policy is hard to describe in such a short amount of space, and we know that this is a major undertaking for teams. So we've linked to some other policy tools that Learning Forward has developed over the years that will help you understand, help teams sort of develop a method for scanning their current policy and assessing where it supports or potentially does not support use of the standards. So this is a tool within a tool, I would say, on this particular page. And on the next page as well, we know that an important part of this work is developing your pitch. So we offer some suggestions for how to articulate your argument for making this policy shift or adding this particular policy that you've identified as your goal. And here we talk about the importance of highlighting data relevant to your goal, and also suggest linking, aligning your argument to the federal definition of professional learning, which is also aligned to the standard. So trying to connect some of those dots from federal to state to district policy. And again, another external resource, or a resource from the journal about some examples of how states have made those policy links. So that is my very quick overview of a tool that I hope you'll spend some time looking at, either after this webinar or join us in the lab, where you can dig into it a little more and ask questions. Because we know there's a lot of content in there, and we hope that it's helpful as you're thinking about entering into this policy advocacy work around the standards. And that leads me to welcoming someone who is really a great model in doing this work, and an accomplished district leader and affiliate leader who is doing a lot of wonderful work in Mississippi. Betty Wilson McSwain is the Director of Federal Programs for the Macomb School District in Macomb, Mississippi, and I think has been on top of all of these tools and resources since the very beginning, and we have learned a lot from her, and appreciate her joining our team today to talk a little bit about how policy work is supporting the standards in Mississippi. So on behalf of all of us, Betty, thanks for joining us. And thanks. And could we start maybe with just an overview from you about the work you've been doing in Mississippi to support the standards implementation?
Okay, sure. First of all, I want to say I will have to give a nod to Leanne Long. Dr. Leanne Long was president in 2011 when we first implemented those standards. And she worked very well with the State Department, along with our executive director at that time, and still our executive director, Mrs. Sarah Mann. And those two, along with some other board members, went to the State Department. And at that time, and now we have State Department members on our board. But we work with the Office of Professional Development. We work closely with the Office of Accreditation in order to implement or infuse the Learning Forward standards in the accreditation standards. So in Mississippi, we have an accountability manual. We have performance standards and process standards. And if you look at process standard 15, we are very proud that our advocacy work actually yielded that particular policy, where your professional learning plans at the local district have to be aligned with the Learning Forward standards. And it is worded in a way that when Learning Forward changes, as they have updated our standards in 2022, then the state also updates. And so we've spent the last year, and we are still involved in an awareness campaign, ensuring our district leaders, particularly our federal program directors, are aware of the standards. What do they look like in implementation? And how do you write those plans so you see that alignment or that cohesiveness of the standards with the practices? We're very proud of that. In that accreditation standard, it actually says that all districts other than high performing, which we have an A through F accountability system, so that would be any district that is not labeled A or B. However, in another document that the state has with our federal programs office, in that particular office, our Title II funds, in your application, you have to state, how does your professional learning plan actually include the Learning Forward standards? And no one is excluded unless you don't have those funds, and we all do have those funds. And so we're very proud of that. It goes back to the U.S. Department of Education and how they have aligned those particular standards. And they don't say Learning Forward standards. What they do say is professional learning that yields high performances on your state high accountability, or high, curriculum standards. So you have to know content, and that's part of our professional expertise, collaborative inquiry. All of those things speak to making sure that our students are grasping with mastery those high content standards, that have mastered those content standards. So we're very proud that there are two mandates, so to speak, in the accreditation process, in the federal program application, and then even funding. All of those things are tied to best practices. And when we look at your tool today, it talks about policy actually promotes those best practices. It says that effective policy informs effective practice. We agree with that. And we agree that when you put it in writing, you don't leave it to chance. And so I'm very proud to be a part of that. We're still doing that now, just as we did in 2011. We're on an awareness campaign. We're very proud to bring learning forward to Mississippi as 6 regional activities, 6 regional 2-day awareness sessions all across the state of Mississippi. And we did, again, the 6 sessions where we gave people flexibility in the dates and flexibility in the location so that you could come and hear about these standards. We are embarking on another campaign in June where we're looking at how do you develop those learning plans. And Learning Forward even has a tool online where it talks about developing those professional learning plans. There's a 5-step protocol that you may use, but there are several resources, just like the resource that was used today. So we want to protect our practices, best practices. We want to protect them through policy. Your local school districts have to comply with those policies that are listed at the state level, but we don't want it to just be a compliance. I love that you have the research information. It was out there first when we first introduced the standards, that you can go and look at the rationales, look at the variety of research that all correlates to a meta-analysis of why these are the standards, why they are the best practices. And of course, they come in STEM, that we want equitable and excellence outcomes for all of our scholars. And so again, we are protecting best practices. We're not doing it for compliance. However, policy and procedures do protect those best practices.
Thank you so much. There is so much in there, and I encourage people listening, if they have questions, to please put them in the chat, because this is an opportunity, I think, to speak with someone who has done this work on many different levels and understands sort of the connections between policies, funding requirements, and really understands how to move from compliance to full meaningful implementation. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, because we will have a chance to have a little conversation here.
I'm going to add one more level, if you'll let me add one more level.
Yes, please.
Mississippi just recently passed a law where the National Center for Education and the Economy, the NCEE, were very profound in establishing a team, as you had just mentioned. And it was a team of 15 superintendents and some other NCE personnel, but they appealed to our local legislators that we needed to do a study in Mississippi on professional learning in high-performing countries. That did pass. Everybody voted but 3 members. We don't know why those 3 members didn't vote, but that was a resounding that this was something that was needed. And it's a study group at this time for the next phase to be funding. But of course, always awareness is step 1. And so we're very proud for that initiative to have passed. And we began to educate not just our educators, but we have to educate those persons who are actually creating policies and protecting policies as well. And that would even include our school board members. Okay.
Yes, excellent. I wanted to ask, so this is, what you're describing is almost like a patchwork of different ways to support the standards implementation. I'm wondering what your suggestions would be for individuals who might be just starting out in this work. What would be, if you want to tell your first foray into this work, or what would your recommendations be for people looking at how to start this work?
I'll tell you that Learning Forward Mississippi has a board by design that includes key stakeholders. It's not just district personnel. We have institutions of higher learning. We also have 4 board members who are employed at the Mississippi Department of Education. One of the members is also in charge of professional learning at the State Department. That's Dr. Lee Johnson. She's opened many doors for us to have conversations, to sit at the table to plan for our colleagues in local districts. And we're very proud of that opportunity. So I like that you said choose about 8 people and know who your key players need to be, so that you'll know where to start. So for us, starting at the State Department was the most logical answer for us. This year to embark to or expand to the legislators, I think is fantastic. But that comes too from working and networking with a variety of people. So where do you need to protect policy? And then at a local district level, of course, our school board policies are those policies that ensure that you have the right practices in place. Also, there's a policy where our school board members have to, when we have service contracts, particularly when you talk about external providers. One of our conversations the other day is what are the look-fors when you're doing work with external providers, because you want to protect your school board members. You want to bring in those providers that are actually going to yield what you're expecting, and you want to be able to show numbers so that members of your school board know that they have made the right decision. And so I think all of those things are important. I think it starts with conversations.
Yeah.
I think we have to be very conscientious of our pace. We don't want to go too slow that we don't get anything accomplished, yet we have to give people an opportunity to be aware of what you're speaking about and be able to embrace. So to me, even beginning conversations, but sharing research in a manner that is not over anyone's head, but this is the reason why we want to do this. And it all goes back again to the STEM. It's really all about student outcomes. But if we don't take a step-by-step process, then you may lose that, and you may not arrive at what you're expecting.
That's great. And did you say you started building that shared understanding with with the state level, with the state agency,
Right.
and then the regional educator learning sessions around the standards? And then we have a question in the chat about what kind of professional learning are you doing with principals, since they are often the key leaders in the professional learning decisions.
Okay, and that is excellent. And I'll even invite Mr. Fleming, who's doing some excellent work also with the Wallace Foundation. Last summer, as we embarked upon these standards in April of 2022, in June of 2022, we partnered with the Wallace Foundation, who does a lot of work with the principal as the leader of a school, and second only to a teacher as far as the impact on student learning. And a lot of them, just to take one step back, of course, we have to educate ourselves. And as a board, we do that. We do book studies. We actually present to one another. And so you have to know what you're speaking about. But I was excited last year, I believe it was February's meeting, where Fred Brown, our executive director, came on and talked about the work with Wallace Foundations and the highlight of the principals' work and the difference that they make. And so we did partner with them. With Wallace Foundation. Paul Fleming will actually be with us again on June 5th. He is now leading that work in partnership with Learning Forward. There's a partnership between Wallace Foundation and Learning Forward, and Mr. Fleming leads that work. And so we definitely want principals to understand that. There is actually a document now that is recently published by Learning Forward that talks about just the principal, the guide for the principal. And that's for you to know, what do you need to do in your school? In my district, we have purchased that for our principal so that we can do a book study on that, because as the lead learner for that building, then we certainly want you to know best practices. But I'm very sure Mr. Fleming can add to that. And I don't want to lose anything that he may could share.
That was great. Thank you, Betty. And I appreciate, and like you're right on the mark, obviously, with recognition, as you said, in Mississippi, how important the principals are. And you mentioned the action guide, the principal action guide that is designed so that principals can really, think critically. We talk a lot about personalized learning for students, But for the principal role, it's how do you personalize professional learning for all your staff, paraprofessionals, educators, everybody that's in your building, and how important that is. And that's why that action guide is also a helpful resource to think about what are the steps and what are the first decisions that principals need to make in order to make sure that the professional learning is aligned. It also meets the needs, right, of those that are in your building, because we know how varied buildings are and the culture in different schools are. And so all of that is part of that. So thank you for expanding on that as well. Appreciate that.
Yeah. And I love the way you are leading with the research and leading with the data. I think that's such an important strategy, because often, people don't understand their own context. So leading with the data that's most relevant to the decision makers is a great strategy. And then there is a lot of research about what types of professional learning strategies lead to the improvements that everyone wants to see. And I love that you're highlighting the Wallace research, because that's the piece that actually is not highlighted as much as we wish it were in the meta-analysis, because people leave it out of studies often. And so the Wallace piece, the Wallace supported research about the impact of principals is such an important addition there. So thank you. I'm wondering if Paul you've both mentioned a couple of resources that are helpful for people as they're starting out on this journey. Are there any others that you found useful that you'd want to call attention to for people?
Well, for me, there is a document that when I first started in 2022, the research document, there is, when you go to resources, there's a document just on the research. I found that to be really profound in my use, because I'm trying to gain believers, build credibility. And so in some of that, there are some relevant pieces that maybe we've used before. And when we can make those connections, then I think people can understand why we're taking this path to ensure that we're implementing these standards and implementing them correctly.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, we had a question in the chat about really how do you move forward if there are bumps in the road, if there are some districts or individuals or departments that are not embracing the standards. And I think that you're giving us a lot of good responses and examples of how you move forward in that way. Is there one policy that you would point to or wish for that you would love to see happen in your own state or in other states, maybe, that could move this implementation forward?
Yes. And when you look at our process standard 15, it actually talks about the learning forward standards, or the standards for professional learning and high quality instruction, but I also look at the professional growth system for our teachers, for our educators, for our leaders. And how do we use those learning forward standards to actually inform best practices? When we look at our rubric, I'll just use a teacher, for example, there's a 1 through 4 rubric, there are various domains, and we want to surely have 3 and 4s in our classrooms, okay? So those are high performing levels. And I've been speaking with one of my colleagues at NCEE, and we are talking about how the standards don't necessarily align what they speak to. They give the how. When you look at the rubric for high performance and what teachers should know and know how to do, then the standards, and again, they operate together. They don't operate in isolation. But which of those standards could you, if a teacher, say, was at a 2, but you really wanted that teacher to move to a 3, how can you then go and let's see these professional learning standards in order to use them as the how in the roadmap to increase the capacity and the effectiveness of that teacher? And so I would like to see them operating simultaneously. I would like to see with the professional growth systems, you have to give feedback. What I would like to see is a step further, use the learning forward standards in your feedback, particularly when you're looking at growth plans, because I don't want to just know that I need to grow in this area. I would like a roadmap of how do I get there.
Yes, right.
And
Excellent.
if I could just add to that, that's a great point about maybe the connection between individual professional growth plans and school professional learning plans, and what that
Excellent.
sounds like that's the direction you're thinking about. And I think
Yes.
that's so innovative, because often districts and states understandably see those as separate, right?
Right.
And you're saying like the through line is feedback, and making sure even for retention of highly effective educators, everybody needs feedback in order to get better, and how the professional learning centers might play a role in that.
Right.
Mhm.
And you want cohesiveness in all that you do. You know, there needs to be an overarching vision, but then how do you arrive at that? And I don't want outliers. I don't want this document or this procedure here and this one over there. They all need to work together.
And I know, yeah, just a quick follow-up is, I know from where you sit with federal programs, I think sometimes the tendency, and we see this working across the country very understandably, is that often the funding will drive the planning for high quality implementation, rather than the planning driving the funding. And just wonder if you could speak a bit to that, of how do you help
Mhm.
change that mindset, so it really is thinking carefully about like your Title II funds, right? To think about the maximizing the bang for the buck, right? Yeah, I'd love to hear
So
that.
when we do our needs assessment, that comprehensive needs assessment is so important. You can't do it haphazardly, and you can't be doing after, okay, I really want to do this, now let me apply the funding. It is, let's see what we really need. Let's prioritize, even when we think about implementation of the standards, let's prioritize what can we get done within this funding period. And then that helps to actually put the correct funding to the outcomes that you're expecting. But a lot of times we'll do a budget before we do a needs assessment. And that's not the way to do that. We really need to think about, you know, where are we now? What's our context? And that's even in the 5-step plan of how you do your professional development plan. You got to consider, what's your data? When you talk about that frame for the rigorous learner, content for the rigorous learning, you're looking at, when you talk about, that's the what, right? So when you look at curriculum, assessment, and instruction, one of the things in our Learning Forward affiliate meeting, curriculum assessment, then instruction. We talked about, you know, that's usually not how it is, because we usually say CIA, curriculum, instruction, assessment, but it's intentional. You want to look at your curriculum standards and those high performance standards. Then you want to look at how they are assessed. When you marry the two of them, then that will yield a type of instruction that is needed.
Yeah.
And so until you really study that, you know, you'll look at it, but you'll miss it. And so we have to do in-depth study, so we really change our practice, because a lot of people just do lesson plans, make out a test, and then, do lesson plans, do the instruction, then make out a test. And then sometimes it doesn't match with the assessment that your summative assessment is going to measure, right? So you really want to know your pieces so your delivery is appropriate. Okay, that's in everything we do. We need to know our pieces. Where do we stand? You know, how are children mastering standards? When you look at longitudinal data, how are teachers mastering these standards? Because longitudinal data becomes teacher practice, not the cohort of students. And so you need to look at all those things so they inform you as you begin to build a plan.
Thank you. Yeah, that's powerful.
Well, I hope, Betty, that you're seeing all the appreciation and love in the chat for you sharing your perspective. And I will echo that and say, you know, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all the work you're doing in Mississippi and with the affiliate, and for all your wisdom today that you shared today. Thanks so much. And I'll turn it back to Paul to close us out.
Yeah, again, echoing that. Thank you, Betty, because the reason why we wanted you here is to make sure people see what's possible, what is a model, and also in an area where, you know, you're obviously reflective of some student and demographics that are in the real world, right, and are really reflective of our times. And I think that's important as well. And also appreciate, as the tool talks about, there are many pathways for moving, you know, getting policy in place. So you said to protect powerful practices. And we know there are many pathways, there are many journeys. And again, grateful that you really are showcasing and advocating and being a champion today and in your work around those policy pathways, because we know it's not abstract, right? It's not just a responsibility at the state level, for example, right? Or at the federal level, but what does this look like and sound like at the district level? Because we know it impacts every student. And again, grateful for your work and your leadership. And Elizabeth said there was a lot of love in the chat, so hope you're feeling that as
I
well.
appreciate that.
Yeah, we
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that today and in your ongoing work. So we're going to close out just quickly this afternoon with a couple of reminders. One, we hope that if many of you, if you've never been to a Learning Forward annual conference, that you stop everything and you register, because one, last year's conference sold out ahead of time. So we want to make sure you know about it. Registration is open. It will be happening in DC. We have some fabulous keynote speakers, as well as concurrent sessions, and really like a 4-day powerhouse of a professional learning experience. So we hope that you're able to attend and that you go and are able to register and do that quickly, since again, we anticipate selling out by the end of the registration time period for this year's conference. So we're excited about that. We would also make a note that we will be here now for tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow to reveal the revised and updated standards assessment inventory that many of you might know from the previous version of the standards. And that's going to be exciting to showcase now what those new aligned items are to the 11 standards. And then finally on Friday, bringing it all home, as we know that how important it is to embed equity across all of our work and the multiple dimensions of equity that show up in the work of all of you that are joining us. And so we hope that you will be there with us to highlight kind of 5 key challenges that we're seeing and hearing from across the country around equity. And as mentioned by Betty, our very own CEO, Fred Brown, will be with us to share insights about what that equity tool can look like and sound like, as well as in the tool, aligning a lot of resources that we've worked hard at in the last few years around equity to have at your fingertips. Again, I mentioned the one-stop shop, but we're a big believer in that. So you go to one document for having all of that work. So we hope that you're able to take part of that as well. And then finally, and that's again 3 p.m. Eastern for tomorrow and for Friday. And then finally, as Elizabeth mentioned, we would love if you have time today to stick around for our standards lab, which will be happening immediately following the end of this. Do we have the link now? Elizabeth, I'm checking to see if has that been in the chat yet.
I will put it in the chat right now.
Thank you. So we have that available. We would love for you to stay, have additional questions or your own challenges, and maybe something you've heard from Betty that really sparked hopefully some inspiration and some renewed energy for really taking on policy and doing it that fits your context with that. Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth, for putting that. A reminder, you need to copy that link, and if you can put that in your calendar, because it will go away at the end of this webinar. And so that's important to have that link there too, and to make sure you have it. So again, thank you so much, Betty. Thank you, Elizabeth, and to everybody for joining us this afternoon. We hope you have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you back tomorrow and Friday at the same time.